Welcome to Arcane Testament. Before we dive into today's story, if you enjoy content that makes you question reality, subscribe to the channel and become part of this journey. And tell me in the comments you're watching from which country. Drop your country's name below. Now ask yourself this: what if some of your strongest memories were never wrong, but reality itself changed? Let's begin. What if the most reliable thing you believe you own, your memory, is quietly betraying you? You don't notice it happening. There's no warning, no sensation of loss. One moment you are certain, the next you are corrected, and the correction feels wrong. Not slightly wrong, deeply wrong. As if someone reached into your past and moved something when you weren't looking. You remember details with confidence. A name, a phrase, a moment burned into childhood or culture so clearly that questioning it feels absurd. Yet when evidence appears, it doesn't match. Books say one thing, recordings say another. History itself insists you are mistaken, but you're not alone. That's what makes this unsettling. Thousands, sometimes millions of people share the same memory, the same misplaced certainty, the same quiet shock when they discover the discrepancy. Strangers describing the exact thing you remember, wrong in precisely the same way. At first, it's easy to laugh it off. A typo, a misquote, the mind playing tricks, except it keeps happening. Across years, across cultures, across people who have never met and have nothing to gain by pretending. And slowly, the question shifts. Not, what do I remember, but why do I remember it this way? Because if your memory can be altered, rewritten, or collectively misaligned without you noticing, then what else feels solid only because you've never been forced to check? This is where the discomfort begins. Not with answers, but with doubt. A crack in the assumption that reality is fixed and shared. Once the doubt takes hold, the examples start flooding in. People recall the same children's books spelled a certain way. The same movie lines spoken with unmistakable clarity, the same logos, the same moments, the same endings. Not vague impressions, specific details. Letters, words, phrases. Details you don't usually invent by accident. Ask someone casually and they'll answer without hesitation. Ask them to check, and the hesitation comes later. Confusion, resistance, that uncomfortable laugh people make when something doesn't line up, but they're not ready to admit it. What's disturbing isn't that memories are wrong. It's that they're wrong together. You'll hear it again and again. I remember it clearly. Not, I think, not maybe. Clearly, as if certainty itself is part of the phenomenon. Parents remembering what they read to their children. Fans remembering lines they repeated for years. People recalling moments they bet money on. And when proof is shown, books, clips, archives, it doesn't feel like learning something new. It feels like being told something familiar has been replaced. Like returning to a childhood home and finding the walls rearranged. Online, these stories pile up. Thousands of comments echoing the same disbelief, the same frustration, the same question: when did this change? Some remember discovering it years ago, others only yesterday. Yet no one remembers the change itself, only the before and after. That absence is strange. If something shifted, why doesn't anyone remember the moment it did? Skeptics point out how easily stories spread, how repetition shapes belief. But that explanation struggles with one detail. Many people encounter these discrepancies alone, independently, before ever hearing the term for it. The shock comes first, the explanation comes later, and once you notice one example, you start noticing others. Each one weaker on its own, stronger together. A pattern forming not in facts, but in feeling. A sense that reality is quietly disagreeing with your past. At this point, laughter fades, curiosity deepens, because if this were just a mistake, it should feel simple, correctable. It doesn't. It feels personal. And that's when the mind reaches for answers, any answers that can restore stability. Something to explain how so many people can be wrong in exactly the same way without realizing it. The most comforting explanation is also the least threatening. The mind is flawed. Memory, after all, is not a recording. It's a reconstruction. Each time you recall something, you rebuild it, filling gaps, smoothing edges, borrowing details from similar experiences. Over time, the rebuilt version replaces the original. Not because you're careless, but because that's how cognition works. Psychologists have names for this. Pattern completion, suggestibility, source confusion. The brain prefers coherence over accuracy. When something almost fits, it snaps it into place. A familiar surname becomes more common than an unusual one. A vague movie quote becomes cleaner, more dramatic, more repeatable. The version that spreads best survives. Add repetition and social reinforcement, and confidence grows. Hearing others repeat the same incorrect version doesn't weaken belief, it strengthens it. Familiarity masquerades as truth. Eventually, the incorrect memory feels older, deeper, more authentic than the real one. From this perspective, nothing supernatural is happening. Just human brains doing what they evolved to do. Simplify a messy world. And yet, something still feels off. If this were only about suggestion, you would expect gradual distortion. soft edges, variations. But many of these memories are sharply defined and eerily consistent. The same wrong spelling, the same wrong phrasing, the same wrong detail, recalled with the same certainty by people separated by age, culture, and geography. More troubling is the emotional reaction. Being corrected doesn't feel like learning, it feels like losing something. Like being told a piece of your past never existed. That sense of displacement is hard to explain with simple error. There's also timing. Some people notice the discrepancy before encountering anyone else who does, before forums, before explanations, before the idea itself. The realization arrives unprompted, followed by a search for answers, not the other way around. The rational model explains a lot, but it doesn't explain everything, not the conviction, not the shared specificity, not the persistent feeling that something fundamental has been tampered with. And when an explanation leaves residue questions, it can't fully dissolve the mind, does what it always does. It looks for another framework, one that doesn't just explain the mistake, but the unease. That's where things stop being comfortable, because the next explanation doesn't blame memory. It blames reality. The alternative explanation begins where logic starts to fail. What if the memory isn't wrong? What if it's simply no longer correct here? This idea doesn't come from science textbooks. It comes from the quiet space left behind when familiar explanations fall short, from the feeling that something has shifted without leaving fingerprints. The theory suggests that reality itself isn't singular, that it branches, overlaps, and occasionally collides. In one version of the world, events unfolded exactly as you remember them. Names were spelled differently. Words were spoken differently. Outcomes landed on the other side of chance. And for reasons no one can fully explain, fragments of those realities didn't stay contained. They followed you. Some imagine subtle timeline corrections, small enough not to collapse everything, large enough to leave residue. Others talk about parallel universes brushing against each other, exchanging details like static across a radio signal, not dramatic jumps, no flashes of light, just a quiet overwrite. In this view, the Mandela Effect isn't a mistake, it's evidence. Memory acting as a fossil record of a prior configuration of reality. A version you lived in long enough to remember, but not long enough to stay. That would explain the certainty. Why these memories don't feel imagined. Why they feel retrieved. Why correction feels invasive, like something being taken rather than added. It would also explain why no one remembers the change itself. If the transition were seamless, if consciousness simply carried forward while the environment adjusted around it, there would be nothing to recall, only the mismatch left behind. Critics dismiss this as fantasy, and maybe it is. There's no instrument to measure alternate histories. No experiment to confirm a timeline fracture. But the absence of proof doesn't erase the question, it amplifies it. Because once you allow for the possibility, even hypothetically, everything feels less stable. If reality can shift without announcement, then memory becomes the only witness. And witnesses, by definition, remember what once was not what remains. The unsettling part isn't the idea of multiple realities. It's the implication that you might have crossed between them without noticing. And if that happened once, how would you ever know if it happened again? Whether you accept the rational explanation or lean toward the speculative one, both lead to the same uncomfortable place. Certainty erodes. If memory is as fragile as psychology suggests, then your sense of self built from remembered moments, choices, and experiences is less solid than it feels. The past becomes a story you keep retelling, slightly different each time, until even you can't tell where truth ends and reconstruction begins. But if the more unsettling possibility is true, if reality itself can shift, then memory isn't fragile at all. It's misaligned. A survivor of something you're no longer allowed to access. In that case, the unease you feel isn't confusion, it's recognition. Either way, the Mandela Effect forces the same reckoning. You don't experience reality directly. You experience it through interpretation, recall, and agreement. Through a shared consensus that feels stable only because most days it doesn't challenge you, until it does. And when it does, you're left with a choice. Dismiss the feeling and move on, or sit with the discomfort and ask what it means that something so fundamental can slip without warning. Maybe nothing extraordinary is happening. Or maybe extraordinary things happen quietly, leaving only doubt behind. The most unsettling part isn't that the answers are unclear. It's that once you've questioned your memory, once you've questioned reality itself, you can't fully return to certainty. And from that moment on, every remembered truth carries a shadow. At some point, the search for an answer becomes less important than the realization it leads to. You may never know whether these shared memories are errors of the mind or echoes of something else. No final proof will arrive to settle it cleanly. No announcement will clarify what changed, or if anything changed at all. What remains is the awareness, an awareness that memory is not a vault, but a living thing, that confidence is not evidence, that reality as you experience it depends on trust in your senses, your recall, and the silent agreement between you and everyone else that what you see is what is. The Mandela Effect doesn't demand that you believe in alternate worlds. It only asks you to notice how easily certainty can fracture, how quickly something you know can become something you're told never existed. And once you've noticed that fracture, it doesn't fully close. From then on, every familiar detail carries a quiet question. Every remembered moment feels slightly provisional. Not false, but not unassailable either. Maybe the world hasn't changed. Maybe only your relationship to it has. Because the true disturbance isn't the possibility of parallel realities. It's realizing that the past you trust lives only in your mind, and even there, it may not be safe. And now that you've questioned it, you'll never remember the same way again.